As you can see, we're picking up in Mark, the 6th chapter, beginning at verse 14, and we will read through verse 29. Again, starting in Mark, the 6th chapter, beginning at verse 14. Now King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known, and he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. Others said it is Elijah, and others said it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, This is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John, and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. Verse 18, For John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Therefore Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. Verse 21, Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced, and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you. He also swore to her, Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom. Verse 24, So she went out and said to her mother, What shall I ask? And she said, The head of John the Baptist. Immediately she came back in with haste to the king and asked, saying, I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. Verse 27, And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought, and he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl, and the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. And so now we're going to just kind of go through and we're going to break down verses 14 through 16. King Herod heard of him, for his name had become well known, and he said, John the Baptist is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work with him. Others said it is Elijah, and others said it is the prophet, or like one of the prophets. But when Herod heard, he said, This is John, whom I beheaded. He has been raised from the dead. And so when we first read this idea of when Herod heard of him, we understand that he is talking about Jesus. This is whom he had heard of. But he makes the claim that it was John the Baptism that maybe had risen from the dead. And so one of the quick things that we need to recognize in this verse is that John the Baptist is no longer living. And so we don't have a whole lot of detail up to this point as to what has happened, but in these verses we find out that John has been beheaded, and that Herod actually believes that this is John raised from the dead performing these many things, because the disciples are preaching about all of these various miracles that are being done. Now others are going to make the claim that he's Elijah, which is based on the belief that Elijah would return prior to the coming of the Messiah. So there were those who believed that Elijah would come back before the Messiah would come, and so they believed that this must be Elijah. Others simply said he is a prophet. They were willing to believe that Jesus was special, but they were unwilling to claim him as the Messiah. And if we were to relate this to the world today, and if we were talking with people, there are many today who have all kinds of other descriptions for who Jesus was. Some would say, yes, he truly was a prophet, but not the Son of God. There are some who would say that he just was a really good man. He was a really good teacher, but they won't accept the fact that he is the Son of God. So this is not something that we don't find as being even common today, with the denial of the fact that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, or if not the denial, just not accepting that as fact. Moving on to verse 17, For Herod himself had sent and laid hold of John and bound him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, for he had married her. And John had said to Herod, It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife. Then Herodias held it against him and wanted to kill him, but she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just and holy man, and he protected him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly. And so we see that Herod himself was responsible for placing John the Baptist in prison. And this is because because Herod had actually married his brother's wife. And we find that John was not afraid to stand up to him and to say that this is wrong. What you're doing is not lawful. And so Herod then decides to place him in prison because his now wife, who was his brother's wife, is angry with John the Baptist for speaking out against their marriage. And so again, this is a good time to talk about the fact that even though it may be a difficult thing, it is important that when something that is being done is wrong, that it violates God's law, that it's not something that should happen, that one must speak up. And we see here also that kind of effects that it can have if we do that. That there may be those who become angry, who may wish us ill, who may try to actually harm us. But we also see here, Herod doesn't want John killed because he recognizes John as a just and holy man. And so prison was actually a way for Herod to protect John from Herodias. As long as John was in prison, she could not get to him. And Herod heard what John had to say very gladly. So despite the anger that his wife had, Herod recognized that John was a just and a holy man, and so he initially tries to protect him. Moving into verses 21 through 25, we see that this is not going to work. Then an opportune day came when Herod on his birthday gave a feast for his nobles, the high officers, and the chief men of Galilee. And when Herodias' daughter herself came in and danced and pleased Herod and those who sat with him, the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you want, and I will give it to you." He also swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you up to half of my kingdom." So she went out and said to her mother, "What shall I ask?" And she said, "The head of John the Baptist." And immediately she came in with haste to the king and asked, saying, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." So we see here that Herod is celebrating his birthday, and so he has brought all the great officials and all the main chief people in the city, and he's brought them before him to spend this time with him, and throws a party for himself and for them. And as part of this party, Herodias' daughter comes and dances for Herod, and he is greatly pleased. So, in this state of being pleased with the situation, he offers the girl anything that she would desire, even up to half his kingdom. At this point, I would stop and I would make a comment potentially that be careful what it is that you say you will do for someone, unless you're absolutely, truly meaning to do it. We can't just react in a moment. We can't go about making promises that we are not willing to keep. And sometimes when we act without thinking, when we act on emotion, which is how he is acting, because he's pleased with the dancing, he decides to act on his emotion, we may suffer the consequences. Because the girl asks her mother what it is that she should ask for, and Herodias says, "John the Baptist's head." And so now is the opportunity, even though Herod had tried to protect John by keeping him in prison out of the reach of his wife Herodias, she now has an opportunity to find a way to get around that and to ultimately have him killed. And so she tells her daughter this is what she desires, and immediately the daughter requests this of the king. And so in verses 26 through 29, we will finish out this section. And the king was exceedingly sorry, yet because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he did not want to refuse her. And immediately the king sent an executioner and commanded his head to be brought. And he went and beheaded him in prison, brought his head on a platter and gave it to the girl. And the girl gave it to her mother. And when his disciples heard of it, they came and took away his corpse and laid it in a tomb. So initially when King Herod hears this request, he's exceedingly sorrowful. He's sorrowful. He doesn't want John to be harmed. He sees him as a holy and a just man. He actually fears what John can potentially do, but he obliges her because of this promise that he has made, and because of the fact that it was made in front of all of these people that were watching, and he didn't want to look like a person that would not, or didn't want to look like a person that might go back on their word or back on their promise. So he orders an executioner to bring the head of John the Baptist. This same man who was trying to protect John now orders the beheading of him in prison. And so the executioner comes in, beheads John, and brings John's head on a platter and gives it to the girl. The girl in turn gives it to Herodias, her mother. And when the disciples hear of this, they come and take his corpse and lay it in a tomb. And so you can see there's a lot that you could, if you were teaching someone, that you could expound on. We talked about kind of some of the things that you might want to go into greater detail with, such as the idea of the not willing to accept Jesus as the Christ, but willing to accept that he was someone that lived. We talked about looking at the idea of being willing to stand up and speak the truth, even when it might put you in danger, it may anger others. We've talked about the fact that sometimes, even when we think we're protecting someone, that if we are not careful, that protection may not be able to hold. Herod thought that he was able to go ahead and protect John by keeping him in prison, thought he was able to keep him from his wife. We see that didn't work. You can expand on the idea of what happens when we act upon emotion, when we start making promises in front of people that if we're going to say, we better be willing to carry through, and we better think things through and consider the consequences before we speak. And I would encourage you to consider that sometimes the influences of people that we may have in our lives, and when we do wrong and we put ourselves in a situation that's wrong to begin with, and allow people that shouldn't be in our lives to be a part of our lives, it can put us in danger. You see, if Herod had never violated the law and taken his brother's wife, then this situation never would have come up. John would have never had to express what he had to express, that this was unlawful. Herodias would not have the opportunity to become angry and to ultimately lead about John the Baptist's beheading. And certainly we need to understand, considering who we recognize John the Baptist was and all the good that he had done for Christ, it's sad to see that his life ends in this type of manner. And as a final statement, one more thing that one could expand on is the idea that just because you are a servant of Christ, just because you are doing good for his cause and doing what he asks, does not mean that you won't suffer. In fact, it's because of the fact that he was doing what Christ expected that John did suffer. We will pick up in the coming week in verse 30 of Mark chapter 6. Thank you.